Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Gunfire has been heard near the government quarter of the Ukrainian capital as Russia's invasion of the country intensifies. It's after residents in Kiev sheltered underground following missile strikes overnight. Ukraine's president called the attacks insidious. Earlier this morning, Prime Minister Boris Johnson reassured Volodymyr Zelensky of further UK support, saying the world is united in its horror. President Zelensky has said that Ukraine needs the support of its allies more than ever.
This morning, we are alone in defending our country, just like yesterday. The most powerful forces in the world watch from afar. Have yesterday's sanctions persuaded Russia? We see in our skies and feel on the ground that they are not enough.
Meanwhile, here in the UK, rape victims are being continually and systematically failed by the criminal justice system, according to a joint report by the Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate. A lack of cooperation between police and prosecutors and poor communication with victims is being blamed for cases taking an average of 2 years to come to trial. The UK's COVID-19 vaccine rollout has been praised by a public spending watchdog, despite millions of doses being wasted. A report from the National Audit Office said delivering jabs early helped save lives and reduce serious illness and hospitalisation. 3 former Minneapolis police officers have been convicted of violating 46-year-old George Floyd's civil rights in June 2020. The trio were all charged with failing to provide medical aid when Derek Chauvin held his knee to Mr. Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, the latest from Ukraine. The Ukrainian Defence Ministry has confirmed that Russian forces have now entered the city of Kiev. Gunfire has also reportedly been heard near the government quarter of the Ukrainian capital. Blasts were heard throughout the night as Russian troops advanced. Ukrainian President Zelensky has said 137 Ukrainians have so far been killed since the invasion began yesterday. However, UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says that Russia has failed on day one of its invasion to take any of its objectives, thanks to the Ukrainians fighting back. He also says that UK intelligence has confirmed 450 casualties on the Russian side. But President Zelensky says that while Ukraine is indeed fighting back, he feels they're fighting alone, while the West watches from afar. To aid the fight, the Ukraine Defence Force has removed age restrictions for recruits as of today. Well, let's talk through this and the British response today with Alicia Kearns, Conservative MP for Rutland and Melton and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Welcome to the programme. We heard a wide-ranging statement from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons last night. It went fairly far, but it was notable that in certain areas that many in the United States and the United Kingdom that people had been calling for, particularly when it comes to international payments, the UK wouldn't move unless the EU moved as well. Is that the right call to make?
Look, yesterday the Prime Minister announced exactly what I've been calling for him to do, which is essentially to cripple the Russian banking system. What we want to make sure is that they can't trade internationally in finance, and that would mean that essentially they have to use down their foreign currency reserves, they'll have no liquidity, and essentially when you starve a bank of cash and cash flow, that's when they crash, and that's what will hurt those around Putin. Now, in terms of the SWIFT system, yes, it's quite clear the EU is not willing to move, and that's really vital because of how reliant Russia is on the SWIFT messaging system with the EU. If we move as one, this would be a nuclear financial strike. However, if we move individually, it won't have as much of an impact. However, I do think with SWIFT, it's important to recognise that actually I think what the PM's announced in terms of sanctions is more impactful than SWIFT, because we shouldn't forget that Russia has a workaround with SWIFT. They can create cut-out banks, fake banks to operate through. So actually, I think cutting off and blacklisting every Russian bank was far more effective.
Now, I know you're someone who's worked a lot in the space of China and the atrocities that are going on within that country. The concern of many is that with Russia being pretty wholeheartedly cut off from the West, they'll lean into their new friends in Beijing in order to finance their deeds. Is that a concern?
It is, absolutely, and I think we should be very clear that this is an attack on Western values. So there's no question that Russia will double down on its autocratic allies, those who will stand by and allow it to commit atrocities. And I think we actually saw the Chinese agree, I think it was a grain agreement with the Russians only yesterday. So there's no question that Chinese absolutely are leaning in, and then they're leaning onto their friends who will stand behind them when they commit atrocities.
Now, for those people watching who may be thinking this is a war hundreds of miles away that is going to have financial effects for us here at home. These sanctions are going to hit people in their pockets. We know that Russia is a big energy exporter, it's a big grain exporter, it's a big oil exporter. These are all essentials, and people are already feeling a cost of living crisis. Was there a better way? Is there any way out, or are we faced with a whole host of bad options?
There are no good options because Putin has decided to declare war in Europe. This is solely the responsibility of one man and his ambitions. And yes, it is going to be difficult, and there will, I'm sure, be increase in the price of bread because Ukraine is the West's breadbasket. But I think anyone this morning who's woken up and seen those images of children, anyone who has seen what has happened with the rocket attacks, there is no one in this country that will not want our government to be doing everything it can. And that's why we have to now lean in terms of humanitarian efforts. And there is so much we can be doing on that. And I hope to see the Prime Minister make an announcement on it.
And just finally in this conversation, we've heard many voices from Ukraine today who feel like they're alone, feel like they're helpless, they're being bombed, they're being shelled, they're being shot at, and Western troops will not enter Ukraine. We have British aircraft circling airspace in Poland and in Romania, but we will not cross over into Ukraine. Now, it's understandable that we do not want to be directly at war with another nuclear power. We do not want to be directly at war with Russia, but do you understand how Ukrainian people feel, as if we are leaving them militarily isolated?
I absolutely understand how they feel, because when I was in Ukraine only 4 weeks ago in Donetsk, on the contact line with the Russian forces, they were very clear with me that it is the West who will decide whether or not there is bloodshed or whether they survive. The difficulty is I don't have the intelligence in front of me, but it looks like the Defence Secretary is saying that Putin currently is unhinged and cannot be trusted to engage in any way with a system that he doesn't respect anyway. So the risk is that if we put any British pilots in the sky, they will be shot down. We will be drawn into a true pan-European conflict. That's why I would like to look at whether we could do anti-aircraft missiles from neighbouring countries, but that would still bring us into direct conflict with Russia. And that's why we have to focus on humanitarian efforts, we have to focus on arming the resistance, and I want to see us launch cyber strikes, because last night's actions do not show that in any way Putin has been deterred, and now we need to hit him even harder, and there is continued escalation available to us that isn't full-on military conflict.
Cyber strikes from Britain against Russia. This is edging very close to direct conflict. No two nuclear powers have ever been at war with one another in the history of the world. Is that now a real risk?
It is a real risk, but let's be very clear. Russia is a pariah state. They carried out chemical weapons attacks on our streets. They hit us with cyber attacks almost every single day. So this is something that they've been doing already. But the fact is, if we wanted to cripple their system with cyber attacks, we could do so and do so effectively. And it would be nothing other than they've been doing us for us a long time. Yes, it would be an escalation. But when I see bloodshed on European streets, that's exactly what I want to see. I want the cost to really hurt Putin and those around him.
Well, Alicia Kearns, thank you so much for joining us here on the briefing this morning. Really important developments there and strident opinion. We really appreciate your time this morning. Of course, member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee there. Now, let's move on to the diplomatic perspective now. So Christopher Meyer has served as British ambassador to the United States and to Germany in the past and joins me now. Welcome to the programme, Sir Christopher. First of all, I do want to dive into this issue of Germany, a country that you have served as ambassador to in the past, which seems to be moving at a far slower pace than other Western allies when it comes to full-throated sanctions against the Russians. Why is that?
Well, I think Germany has accelerated its pace beyond what you suggest. The Germans rallied to the European Union position, which was reached in the early hours of this morning, to put together a very sizable package of sanctions against Russia. But the reason for Germany having gone slower than some of the other member states of the European Union, and slower than us, for example, now we're out of the European Union, is that it has a long, complicated history with Germany, with Russia, and it has become, in that relationship, overly dependent on Russia for the supply of energy. And we know all about the gas pipeline, which was to be initiated, which would have sent billions and billions of cubic meters of gas through to Germany, which it's not going to do anymore. So I think the Germans have moved more than we did expect them to do even a week ago. So I wouldn't be too hard on them.
You make a fair case there. However, it does seem to me that simply not buying more gas from the Russians is not the same as reducing the current dependence from the Russians. It doesn't seem to me that big a step to say, oh, we're just not going to buy millions of tons more gas or give billions of euros more to the Russian regime, more so than is currently happening. Surely, for there to be an actual move, this doesn't need to be a hypothetical about what might not now happen in the future. It needs to be about what less might be done now.
The Nord Stream pipeline was about to begin. And it is a very sizable reduction in what the Germans had expected to be able to get in order to for German people to be able to heat their homes, to put it in bluntly. And you've got to, I mean, to be honest with you, Tom, I haven't analysed in detail precisely what the European Union agreed to last night, early hours of this morning, by way of sanctions, but it looks to me like a pretty effective package, both economically and financially, and also in targeting individuals who have been close supporters of Putin. So don't be too harsh there. The other thing you have to bear in mind is that sanctions are not going to produce an instant result. Not in my view. It's not going to deter Putin. Putin will have already priced in a lot of these sanctions. They may be somewhat harsher than he expected, but I think he hoped to be able to drive a dividing line between member states of the European Union and NATO more than has been the case. But in the medium term, what we want to see, and this is really important, there are two things here. The first thing is to degrade the Russian economy in such a way that ordinary Russians feel it through the cost of living, the availability of goods, and things like that, and ourselves to drive a wedge between the Russian people and Vladimir Putin, thus to weaken his position. And the other thing, Tom, which strategically is massively important, even now when we are overwhelmed by the agony of Ukraine, we're told that Kiev will be occupied by Russian troops, maybe later today. Even during Ukraine's hour of agony, we've got to think, what are the limits of Putin's ambitions? And from his point of view, where next? Because
and it's really interesting to see young Russian people take to the streets in Russia as well.
Now, as you and I are talking, prepare for.
It's really interesting to see young Russian people out on the streets. Many have been arrested within Moscow and other cities in Russia. I wonder if that could well be a lever against the Russian president. However, I want to return this conversation to London now. Of course, the Russian ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Office. It's not the first time he has been summoned to the Foreign Office, was given a dressing down by Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. That's happened a number of times in recent weeks. Why is the UK not expelling the Russian ambassador at this stage?
Well, I have to say that I very much hope that that is a fate which he is going to enjoy. I do think lines of communication need to be kept open, but you don't have to have the ambassador there necessarily. I say this as an ex-ambassador myself, but I would expel the Russian ambassador and maybe some of his senior staff, particularly on the military side. If there are any left there, I don't know. After the Skripal business, we got rid of a lot of a lot of people from the Russian embassy, and I don't know exactly who's left there. But we should keep the embassy open. But the ambassador, I think, needs to go home and have a rest in Moscow.
Is there a worry with some of these moves that are being mooted, whether it's expelling an ambassador or banning Russia Today, the Kremlin-backed television channel, that the repercussions on the Russian side will be worse for us than the consequences of us doing it in the first place?
We have never, in our dealings with Russia and the Soviet Union, been afraid of retaliation and repercussion. You do what you think is right. And that is the most important thing. There will no doubt be Russian retaliation. We've been told that the Russians are going to make some announcement, even today, of retaliation against us. Well, good for them. Go ahead, do it. Make my day, if I can speak Clint Eastwood to you. But we have to do what we think is right in the circumstances. And I believe strongly that you cannot, with a Russian invasion based on a series of lies and duplicity, bringing bloodshed to a country that hasn't ever threatened anyone, you cannot just have the ambassador sitting there enjoying the early spring sun.
And where does this end? Are we expecting a lightning war? We're hearing that Russian troops are encroaching upon Kiev as we speak. We know that there have been some reports of gunshots. This may well be the Ukrainian capital being seized even today. What happens in that eventuality?
Well, we can't see clearly what the end of this crisis is going to be. I assume, I hate to say this, but I assume that Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine, is going to fall to Russian forces. That then raises a question whether the kind of panzer attack, I mean, dear God, when I look at the photographs of the Russian attack on Ukraine, and it reminds me exactly of grainy old newsreels of the panzers and the Nazis attacking Poland in 1939. And I think Hitler would be very proud of the way in which Putin has conducted himself. But having said that, from the Russian side, how do they maintain order in Ukraine? This is a country of 40 million people with a younger generation that is going to protest and protest against this. There'll probably be guerrilla warfare. And Ukraine as a running sore in European geopolitics is, I think, going to be there for a long, long time. So we in the West have to think, how do we handle this situation ourselves, as well as watching out, as I said earlier on, for Putin's dabbling elsewhere, which, and I think that the Balkans are the thing most tempting to him. And then there's another thing, which one has to say when talking strategically. At the beginning of the year, Putin sent to the Americans in Washington and to NATO in Brussels draft treaties for the reorganization of European security, which essentially said Ukraine must never be a member of NATO, and secondly, we must revise and roll back the dispensation put in place at the end of the Cold War, which involved bringing in the old Warsaw Pact countries into NATO. Now, those were his strategic objectives. They were unacceptable to us, but there were things there that we could have worked with. What he has done by invading Ukraine is to destroy his own strategic objective, because none of those things now are attainable, and we will not get into a negotiation with a man who is both aggressive and totally untrustworthy, as you would expect from a former KGB.
As the Prime Minister said yesterday, that window for diplomacy is now over. Well, thank you very much for talking us through that in some detail. Sir Christopher Mayer, of course, former British ambassador to the US and to Germany there. Well, let's now get into what's going to happen next. Understandably, a lot of people are concerned. How long will this war last? And will Britain become militarily involved? Well, they're big and important questions, so let's explore them now. Jonathan Kitson is a research fellow at the Adam Smith Institute and a super forecaster at the Good Judgment Project, specialising in defence policy. Welcome to the programme. I suppose the first question that we must ask, as the developments are moving quickly today, what is the likelihood of Russian victory here?
Good morning, Tom. I think given that we're seeing fighting in the suburbs of Kiev and the advancement of Russian forces outside of the outside into the countryside, I think the Russians are very likely to succeed, certainly in isolating the Ukrainian military units and encircling them. I don't think the prospects of a victory are very good, to be honest.
And that's concerning, given the sheer amount of firepower that Russia is deploying. They don't seem to be deploying particularly targeted weaponry at the moment. Is this just sort of blanket attack to pound the Ukrainians into submission?
So the Russians don't have a terribly large stock of targeted munitions like the West has used in its recent wars. And also Russia, although it's demonstrated nuclear deterrence because of its exercises a couple of weeks ago, will be holding some of its precision munitions in reserve in the very unlikely event that it has to go to war or ends up in a conflict with NATO. So they've used about perhaps 200 precision munitions so far in terms of targeting airfields. That hasn't been, terribly successful. But unfortunately, the momentum is with the Russians. The Ukrainians are unfortunately rather outgunned, and this build-up, which has been taking place since last year, has been quite well planned out. I mean, day one objectives haven't been taken by the Russians because war is very unpredictable. Perhaps they were not expecting the counterattack at the airfield next to Kiev yesterday. But the fact we're talking about Russian forces already encircling or already getting near the capital is very concerning for the Ukrainians.
So you mentioned that there's a small possibility that actually this ends up in a NATO Russian conflict, and that's why they're withholding some of their targeted weaponry. How would that happen? I mean, war must usually begin by blunder rather than by conspiracy here.
I think this is a very small possibility. I think it'd be less than 5%. But it's something that they will have thought about. But that's why they won't be using the entire stock all at the same time. It potentially would be a blunder because I don't see at the moment.
And sorry, Jonathan, just in the final 20 seconds here, what more should the UK and the EU be doing? What can we do that doesn't involve direct war?
It needs to massively spend more money on defence, and it needs to spend it much, much smarter. It spent it very, very poorly over the last 20 years.
Well, Jonathan Kitson, I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this conversation, but thank you for talking us through those developing issues there. Finally, now, taxpayer-backed loans could be withheld from prospective students who fail their GCSE English and Maths exams under new government plans announced this week. Now, currently, less than a quarter of graduates pay back their student loan, and this costs the taxpayer billions. The government wants to lessen dropouts and stem the losses in the system. Changes are due to come in from September next year that would lengthen the repayment time, but also end high interest rates, ensuring that no one would have to pay back more than they borrowed. It's a mixed package, but let's talk through it now with Tom Hunt, the Conservative MP for Ipswich and member of the Education Select Committee. Welcome to the programme, Tom. Do you welcome the changes?
No, I mean, I agree with the broad sort of thrust, which is I think that too many people have been going to university. I think the 50% target for people going to university was the wrong target. And actually, I don't think this is a good thing for anyone. It's often not a good thing for the individuals in question who go to university, accumulate huge amounts of debt, often come out with a qualification. It doesn't help them get a good job with good salary, et cetera, and they become disillusioned because of that. And actually, it's not good for a taxpayer either, because so few of them actually end up paying back the loans in full. So, yes, I mean, I agree with the broad thrust of it. I do think, though, that we need to be quite careful to make sure that the measures are appropriate and get the desired effect. I mean, one thing, for example, the GCSE English C and Maths. I mean, I must say that I scraped a C at Maths GCSE. I did quite well at everything else, but I wasn't particularly good at Maths. And I think some of that was down to the fact that I had the learning disabilities that I had, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't achieve academically and couldn't go to university. And I ended up going to university and doing very well at university, but I barely got a C at GCSE Maths. So I just want us to be careful. I agree with the broad thrust of what the government are looking to achieve, but I just think that when it comes to the specific measures and requirements we're putting in place, I just think we need to be. I mean, I do think too many people are going to university, but I do think that I don't want a situation where people who actually could do really well at university could be for them, perhaps not going because of these new requirements. So we've got to get the balance just right, in my view.
And I know that this particular point is going out to consultation. People will be able to put in their own view. That I think the big concern of the government here is that those who go to university before they're ready, potentially giving people the opportunity to do maths and English GCSE more than once, may well help people prepare so that they don't drop out of university then. And that's the big cost to the taxpayer. We talk about tuition fees as if people pay these. Actually, the taxpayer pay for 3/4 of people going to university currently. I'm afraid we're running out of time finally in this conversation. Is there a final word that you'd like to mention on this issue?
No, I mean, I think if you're getting 2 E's at A level in academic subjects, then I think it's highly likely that university will not be for you, and I don't think the taxpayer should subsidise a decision that won't be in the interest of the country. But I think that there is going to be a consultation. I agree with the broad thrust, and I'm sure the Education Committee will be looking at it.
Well, we'll look forward to having you back once we've been scrutinising those plans, and let's see how we can make sure that people pick the right routes in life for them. And I absolutely agree, university isn't for everyone, and there should be a greater credence in society for other routes, more respect for other routes as well. Tom Hunt, thank you for your time this morning. That's it for the briefing this morning. I'm afraid we've run up to the end of the show again, but next it's To The Point with Patrick Christie's and Anaya Falarin Iman. They'll be bringing you more of the latest from Ukraine. But first, here's the weather.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGiven. Following yesterday's cold winds and wintry showers, it is a freezing start in places this morning. Frost and ice about, but plenty of sunshine, and it's looking like a decent day as high pressure builds in from the southwest. That's going to kill off the wind and the showers this morning, and it will lead to plenty of sunshine for at least a few hours in most places. So a bright start to the day, still 1 or 2 showers coming through the Irish Sea coast and northwest England, the Midlands, for example. Otherwise, they tend to ease during the morning. By this afternoon, plenty of sunshine breaking out, and with lighter winds compared to yesterday, it will feel pleasant enough in that sunshine. Temperatures reaching 10 or 11 Celsius in Cardiff, Southampton, London, Plymouth, and for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, 8s and 9s. But for Western Scotland, for Northern Ireland, cloud and some outbreaks of rain move in by the end of the afternoon, falling as snow over the Scottish mountains. That moves through, but it stays cloudy for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, and increasingly breezy tonight and through the early hours of Saturday. Also breezy for western coasts of England and Wales. But elsewhere, clear spells, lighter winds, a touch of frost, 1 to 3 Celsius in the southeast, whereas for Scotland and Northern Ireland, 6 and 7 Celsius because of the breeze and because of the cloud. Mostly, Saturday is looking like a dry day. There'll be plenty of sunshine for England and Wales, hazy sunshine at times with some high cloud in the sky. But thicker cloud for Scotland and Northern Ireland, some light outbreaks of rain and drizzle at times, mainly over western hills, and increasingly windy, risk of gales for the Western Isles as well as for Shetland. That breeze, though, coming in from the south will allow temperatures to reach 9 or 10 Celsius in most spots. Sunday sees an area of rain move in from the west. This will be heavy at first for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. It'll move through into central areas and tend to weaken.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm